Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, an introduction to time-lapse photography, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Rich Udegavea. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Rich. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Kendall, and thank you everyone for tuning in. This is now 2 in a row that I'm doing. It is amazing to have the opportunity, and thanks NatHab and WWF and everyone else for tuning in to this. And we're going to talk a little bit about a very different type of photography today. I would like to take you on a little journey into what is called time-lapse photography. If you're unaware of what it is effectively taking a big chunk of time and shoving it into a much smaller block. This allows us to show things that the eye cannot see. So we're creating video from photos. Now, in the greatest sense of videography and what we see as a moving picture is a group of pictures. Effectively, video is 24 or 25 or 29 photographs every second. And what is put together then, those go really fast, creating these moving pictures, much like an animator would draw each individual frame and then move them very quickly. I used to do them at school in the bottom of my books instead of learning, and then you thumb through them and the little figure moves. So now what we're doing is, instead of taking 29 images with no spacing between them in a second, we might now take 29 images over, say, 2 minutes. Which now that 2 minutes gets shoved into 1 second when we're creating the video. So it creates these amazing portrayals of what's going on. Often we can look up at the sky and see, oh, the clouds are moving. But when you speed it up, it becomes extremely dramatized. So let's have a look at what time-lapse photography looks like. So that's a basic rundown of what time-lapse photography is. It is this combination of images or photographs to create a video, which is taking a large chunk of time and putting it into a smaller chunk of time so that we have a better access as to what is going on. So this can be done in 3 different ways. So how do we do it? One, we can speed up video. So effectively what you do is you take a video, and when you're then playing it back, you push fast forward and you move it along. The problem with this is you need quite good editing software to be able to make it smooth and run correctly, and you need to ensure that your frame rates are not being messed around, because now effectively what you've done is, let's say we're doing 25 frames per second, we're now turning it into, say, 200 frames in a second. So you're really changing the frame rates, which also change the way our eyes perceive the way things flow. The other way is to use in-body time-lapse functions. So a lot of the cameras, the more recent cameras, have a time-lapse function built into it. When I was shooting on Nikon, there was a time-lapse function. You could set up each of the different individual things and move through it from there. Or on the Sonys that I'm now shooting on, there is a setting called S&Q settings. And this S&Q settings, you can go and choose 1 frame every second, which will then create it, and it then takes the photographs and puts them into a video in the end. So this was an example of one that I did in Madagascar. As the clouds were going, I didn't have the space in terms of card space and hard drive space to take individual photos. So I just set it up on my SNQ settings, pushed record. It then takes one photo every second and combines it into a video. And it creates these really cool ways of looking at things. You can see how the forest is breathing. And I love the idea of that. That's what I was trying to show, was this forest breathing. You see the clouds coming out, and it makes it more of a living organism than just looking at a tree on its own. So that's one of the reasons why I would like to use it that way. The other way we could do it, and by far the strongest way of doing it, is by taking individual photographs. Now, what this allows us to do, it allows us to be able to hone in and choose our interval, which is very important, and we'll go through later on what recommended intervals there are. But it allows us to choose our interval, to accentuate movement, to speed it up to an extent that will work well with the brain, maybe not too fast or too slow. So you have to be considering that the whole time. But the other big thing that happens is the editing of videos is very limited. And by speeding up a video or using an in-body time-lapse function, you are working with the video. Even in expensive post-production editing software, you can only get so much out of that image. Whereas shooting individual images allows me the possibility to shoot in RAW, to be able to edit each individual image, or use programs so that I don't edit every image. I edit 3 or 4 or 5 images, and then the program actually applies the graduated edits that need to happen. So these are wonderful ways of doing it, and it helps us be able to get the most out of a scene and create really dramatic time lapses. So here's an example of one that was shot in Uganda with these light rays. We're actually going to look at the edit of this at the end, because there was quite a dramatic contrast when taking the photo. This foreground was very dark, the top level was quite bright, and you have to find a balance between that. And even the best video cameras have a hard time editing that through. Only very recently has raw video become available to us. This is amazing, but it is size, it is space that we just don't have on a lot of these trips. So what do we need for time-lapse photography? The equipment is vitally important. First of all, without a camera, you aren't going to be taking a photograph. So this is quite an important part of the whole thing. Like I say, the more modern cameras will have the ability to do in-body time-lapse, which gives us that option like I used on the forest, where time might be an issue, or I don't have the ability to edit that stuff right away and I need to get the stuff out. That's a great place to start. Different cameras will offer you different things. Again, a lot of the new cameras have an intervalometer built in. Now, this is an important part of time-lapse photography, is the actual looking at how to set up the intervalometer and how to choose the time frames in between the photos. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So cameras are very important. The next thing are lenses. The choice of lens is also going to give you a very different feel. For the most part, time-lapse photography uses wide-angle lenses. They don't have to be particularly fast, so you don't need an f1.4 or 1.8 or 2.8 in order to get great time lapses. Quality lens will make a difference, but any lens will work, because for the most part, we are doing landscape photography when we're doing time lapse. We want a depth of field. We want to see everything from front to back. So the longer your lens, the harder it is to get everything in focus. So we have to consider those things. My favorite lens to do time-lapse photography, Sony's got a 12 to 24 mil. and a 16 to 35 mil. I love those lenses. They're big, they're wide. We're often looking for clouds and how to set those things up and showing that space and that type of movement. The next vital, like beyond vital, once you've got a camera and a lens, your next most important buy is a tripod. And I spoke a bit about this when we were doing the astrophotography a little while ago, but a tripod is a lifelong companion. Very often, and I've made this mistake before, where I went out and I bought a cheap tripod because I wanted something sturdy to put my camera on, but didn't think about the long-term implications thereof. And I set up this amazing setup for an amazing star trail, which the shutter was going to be open for a half an hour. In this case, we could be shooting for a half an hour, 2 hours, depending on what's going on. And what I didn't realize was I hadn't done my homework and the lens and the camera were too heavy. And slowly over time, that lens just slowly started to move, which messed my entire photo up. And it will mess the entire time lapse up. So don't be cheap on buying a tripod. The one I've highlighted here is one that I carry with me on all my trips. It weighs less than 3 pounds, so it's really light, easy to move around. Actually, it's about 2.2 pounds. It's 1 kilo. So it's really light. It's easy for me. I leave 2 pairs of underwear at home, and I have enough weight in my NatHab bag to be able to bring this guy along. And that gives me a lot of options when I'm out there, especially on the photographic trips. So think about this. There's also a very, very nice one that's just been released by a company called Peak Design, and very ergonomically put together and not a lot of space wasted. So beyond the fact that it's light, it also doesn't take up space. So thought in the future. So tripod, vitally, vitally, vitally important. The next thing is a intervalometer. So an intervalometer effectively is a device either built into your camera or that you plug in. So this is one that I carry with me. It's called a Untitled Chapter. And I plug this top one here into the camera, and then I have a remote trigger. And within this, I'm able to set up how long I want it to run for, what the interval is between taking the photos, and it can be anything from 1 second all the way to an hour to 6 hours to 10 hours. I can set that up, no problems. So that's a great help. Or we use the in-body intervalometer, and they are very easy to use. They'll ask you either how long you want to shoot for and how many shots you want, and then all you do is you set up your settings and you leave it alone. It does all the rest for you. The next consideration we have are filters, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, but you can see these are graduated filters here. You might not want the colored aspects, but what it does is it allows us to balance the light of a sunset and a foreground so that you can get your exposure just right. So we're not having to rely too much on post-processing at the end. And the other options are circular polarizing filters. These guys work amazingly well to amplify blues and greens. They darken them down and make them really rich in color. And on top of that, it also slows the shutter speed down a bit. And I will again highlight that in the next bit of slides that we look at. And then the last thing we need is a slider, or you can have. These are very expensive pieces of equipment. A small slider that moves along, what, maybe 30 inches will cost in the region of about $2,000. So it's not a cheap piece of equipment. I've rented a few and used some on shoots before, and they do an amazing job because they create a sense of movement outside of what's moving. So you have a second degree of movement, and here's an example of how that works. You can see how the foreground is now moving, the trees are changing perspective as well as the clouds moving at the same time. So it gives us this really nice flow to things. And what we'll see at the end is I will often shoot in a much larger format so that I can create that movement, but it is never as dynamic as that, because you've got the beauty of this still standing plants now moving, and you can see that the camera's moving as well as the sky's moving as well as the leaves are moving. So all of this plays a massive role in how we get through things. The other thing we need is time. Without time, you're rushing a story and you're not going to get what you need. So you have to plan and prepare for these shoots. So let's talk about planning. Again, I love Ansel Adams and what he said about photography, because he was so clear and concise about what we need to do. And he says, you do not take a photograph, you make it. So when we're taking time lapse, we have to think about what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to show. And we have the 7 P's, which is proper prior planning prevents poor performance. Please, I hope nobody's offended by my use of strange words there, but I think it's very apt in the sense of what's going on here. We have to choose our location. It's not something that you can happen upon it and start it, but very often you're contemplating what's in it. What's my foreground subject? What are the clouds doing? What is moving? How am I going to portray that? The next thing we're thinking about is light. When sunrise and sunset are going to occur, and how we can balance those out in order to create these incredible time lapses. Remember your safety and the safety of your equipment. So if it looks like it's going to rain and you want to get a thunderstorm in, that's great. Make sure that your camera is covered so that it doesn't get wet and you only get one time lapse out of it. And I bring in safety because as a wildlife guide, we're often in areas where there's lions, leopards, all sorts of crazy things that could kill us. If I leave a camera out overnight, it's sure to be chewed on by a hyena. So we've got to consider all of these different things. So any time lapses that I've done at night, I've often connected to a vehicle that the animals then won't jump into. So it's all this planning that goes into it. And here's an example of some of the planning that can take place. This was a time-lapse shot in a place where there's a lot of trout fishing in South Africa. And I had checked the weather and saw that there was mist rolling in, and I'd seen the day before that the mist had rolled in. So I set up a shot to try and capture this mist rolling in as well as the clouds pushing through, which just gives a feel of what the situation is. You can feel the cold, you're out there, and it creates this tranquility. So plan and think about your space as often as you can. We can use apps to help us. So there's a really great app called Photo Pills. And what this app does, this was me at home in lockdown. It chooses my GPS location on the phone. I can see where I am. It shows me lines where sunrise is going to be, where sunset is going to be, where moonrise is going to be, and moonset is going to be. I can see when sunset is, and I can even get a virtual augmented reality to see where the sun will be at a certain time just by standing in an area. So incredible technology that can help us get to these. So Photo Pills is an amazing one, and the Photographer's Empress is also a mad piece of equipment. But I mean, literally we can do 5 webinars just on how to work this beautiful piece of technology that gets given to us, both with stars, with the sun, with the moon, with everything. So those are great things to use to get there. And we'll talk a little bit more about Photo Pills as we go along. So when you're planning your shot, always think about what you're trying to show people, because this is going to tell people or make people feel what you want them to feel. So our settings, vitally important things these. Our shutter speed, we were talking about the fact that video is effectively 24, 25, or 29 photographs every second. And this is very important because that base number is going to be our base number that we're going to work out what our shutter speed should be. And if we do not do this correctly, it creates a strange feeling. If I move my hand like this, and you can just look at my little camera, you will see that my hand is blurring as I'm moving it. Our eyes only see at a certain frame rate. We're only processing light every 24 to 25 to 29 of a second, once every second. I mean 29 times in a second. So we're trying to create the appearance of movement, because if I'm shooting like I would in wildlife, I would be trying to freeze action. In this case, we're not. We're trying to get a little bit of motion blur, because what it does, it becomes more appealing to our eye. Otherwise, the photos or the video feels very sharp and tacky and almost fake. So we have to find that balance between it. So if we're shooting at 24, 25 frames a second, we effectively want a shutter speed that is twice that number. So we want a 50th or a 60th of a second will be ideal for these frame rates. When we're going faster and you're shooting in higher frame rates, like 100 frames a second or 200 frames a second, just for video purposes, we want to be double that. So if we're at 200 frames a second, we want to be at 400th of a second, just to create the normal viewing that we would have. And the reason why we would shoot at faster frame rates in video is to slow it down later. In this case, we're trying to speed time up. And this sort of time length will give us an ideal look at things and a very video feel. If we wanted to create something that was very smooth, especially when it comes to clouds, we could lengthen that shutter speed by 1 to 3 seconds. Now, what that's going to give us and what that means is if we hop back to our equipment, we will have to use filters if we are shooting at the height of a sunny day at noon, or even at times where the light's just too bright, because the camera is not going to be able to get low enough to be able to slow it down enough. So what we do is we take an ND filter, neutral density filter, which basically is a dark piece of glass. It goes in front of the lens and it slows everything down, because now the camera needs to work and open the shutter longer in order to get the same amount of light in, because everything's been darkened down. So that's where those filters really come in. The next thing we have to consider is aperture. Now, aperture we have to think about for two big reasons. One, when we're doing landscape photography, we want a lot in focus. If I'm shooting with a big lens, effectively my focal length becomes smaller and smaller. So what is depth of field? As we can see in here, well, aperture, firstly, the smaller the number, the larger the hole through which light comes in. And every stop we go down, the light is halved. So as we move down, there's less and less light. So if we halve it to here, we have to double the shutter speed. We have to open it for longer in order to be able to get the same amount of light in. And by doing so, the smaller the hole, the bigger the depth of field. So the bigger the F's number, the more in focus. So here you can see this gentleman taking focus on these flowers in front. And what this gives us is it gives us an idea that in it with a shallow depth of field, the flowers are in focus, but everything behind it is out. As we increase our aperture or stop it down and make the hole smaller, we increase our depth of field. The number got bigger, the depth of field got bigger. And what that gives us is more is in focus backwards. Now, the one thing this is not showing quite correctly is that it moves, depth of field moves improportionately front to back. It doesn't stay the same here. So as this moves further back here, it will move closer to you, but it only moves 1/3 close to you and 2/3 behind the subject or the point in focus. So from the focal point, as you increase depth, it'll move 2/3 backwards and 1/3 forward. And then if we go down to say F11, which is great for landscapes, we are now getting everything from the flowers through the moose into the forest behind, all in focus. So when we're thinking about time-lapse, we have to consider that. But there is a problem, because what ends up happening with our aperture ring is every time we take a photograph, the lens starts at its widest point. It then stops down to whatever the f-stop is and then opens up, and then stops down and opens up and stops down and opens up and stops down. So it keeps on doing that. And it doesn't go back to the exact same spot every time. And when you start playing back images that have a slightly more light or slightly less light, you start getting a flicker that occurs. Now, within the program that I'll show you at the end, you can remove this flicker. But for the most part, what we're trying to do is shoot with our aperture wide open. So again, we're at 2.8. We need an ND filter to slow the light coming in so we can slow the shutter speed to create enough blur in order to capture a beautiful flowing time lapse. So consider what aperture you're using. The last part of the settings would be our ISO. ISO is our light sensitivity, and it has a incredible, or the light sensitivity of our sensor. The higher it is, the more sensitive it is to light, which means it lets light in faster or records the light faster. We want to keep this low because we want the shutter speeds to be longer. So this gives us a great advantage. We can lock it down to between 100 and 500. I try to keep it as close to 100 as possible, because this affects dynamic range. Now, dynamic range is vitally important, and especially when we're doing our editing. So if we consider, if we're sitting looking at a sunset, what we see is a beautiful foreground and a wonderfully lit up colored sky above us. Then we lift up our camera and we take the photo, and we either have a beautifully lit up sky with a completely dark foreground, or vice versa, that the foreground is well exposed and the sky is blown out, which doesn't lend itself to what we see. So what we're trying to recreate, and the power of time-lapse photography and taking individual images, is I get to move things. So let's look at that raised photo that we were talking about. This is what the photo looked like. I can then lift up the shadows, and dynamic range means I have stored all the data is still stored within this area here for me to be able to show that there is detail there. The cheaper your camera, the less this dynamic range is. So consider that when you're doing it. It doesn't mean go out, rush out and buy the most expensive camera there is, but if you're gonna take this seriously or make it more than a hobby, I would really consider a high-end camera with a very good dynamic range to be able to edit these images well. So those are our settings. So how long do we do this for? First of all, I want to show you how the intervalometer works. So this is what my Sony looks like. I have an interval shooting function in it, and I can turn this on. Within that, I can choose when I would like it to start. So I don't have to start it immediately. I can say start in an hour's time. What is my interval of shot? What is the distance or the time frame between each photo? And then how many photos do I need to take? And it even tells me how long my shooting time will be. So it gives me an idea of what it is, what I'm going to have to wait for in order to get those 730 photos. It will not tell me what's happening on that. Then I have an auto exposure tracking sensitivity. This is a very important thing, because if I have clouds that are going in front of a sunshine and I go to high auto tracking sensitivity. As soon as it gets darker, it's going to change my exposure to try and balance that out. So that won't work. So I want it on a low change. However, if I'm going through doing what we call a holy grail time lapse, where we're going from daylight through nighttime or from nighttime through daylight, that will change a lot of what's going on. So we have to consider that we need that high tracking sensitivity so that it can slowly stop up and move through those things. So that's how we would set up our camera. So how long do we want our final video to be? Now, if you've ever watched any BBC documentaries or any documentaries at all, time lapse is a very important part of it. They last between 5 and 10 seconds between shots. It's a transitional video. It gives an appearance of something. Now, if a volcano is erupting, cool. I'll watch it for 2 minutes on how it all goes down because that's really interesting. But when there are clouds moving, there's only so much of the clouds doing the same thing that I'm going to be interested in. So we want to try to keep these things to a short enough time. I think 30 seconds is a great amount of time, and I would probably shorten it afterwards because I could choose the best part of those 30 seconds. But these are effectively how many photos you would need in order to get to that point. Now, Photo Pills, again, that app we were talking about, gives us a great idea of what we can do. I'm going to pause this just now. So here I can choose my shooting duration, how long I want my video to be. So 1 minute 30, and I can then set, it tells me my shooting interval and how many photographs I would need and the size of memory that I would use. I can also choose the duration that I wish to shoot for. So if I know an event is going to take an hour, I can set it up for an hour or put it in here for an hour, and it will tell me how long how many shots I need, how many frames per second I can choose, and how much space I need in order to do that. And within this, sorry, I'm just trying to get this guy going again. And it will also allow me to change all sorts of different variables. I'm just trying to get to where that there. And where I can choose my shooting interval or how long my clip would be or the event duration. Those would be set, and you would change the other factors, and it will give you a rundown of exactly what you needed to know in terms of building your profile and getting the right stuff in. Now, how long do we have to set the intervals for? So a storm is normally between 2 to 3 seconds. Here's an example of a storm time lapse. So it's taken in Botswana in the Okavango Delta in green season, mad thunderstorms rolling through. Just love being out there. Calm clouds would be more your 3 to 5 seconds, but that's definitely not calm clouds. Somehow this is all got mixed up. Maybe that's it now. Okay, these are calm clouds. Now, depending on how fast the clouds are moving, we would have to change that number. If they're moving really quickly, we want to speed up the interval. So you want it to 1 or 2 seconds. If they're moving really slowly, you may want to increase the interval to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds in order to accentuate the movement. If you did really fast photos at a 10-second interval, it would just be a mad blur and it wouldn't capture the moment. So you have to really give it some thought, and these are just baseline figures that we're working on. A sunset would be between 5 and 15 seconds. And again, it requires some thought, because if I am in Alaska and with the polar bears and there's a sunset, we know that that sunset is going to take about 6 months to go down. So it's not the best time to be trying to do it. You'd have to have a very long interval to be able to get that. Whereas here in Africa, I mean, especially South Africa, it feels like the whole world is hanging on the sun, and it goes down it's so quickly. So we'd have it probably closer to about 5 seconds at that point. So there's an example of the sun going down and the clouds moving around it. And again, I chose a day where there was a little bit of cloud movement to show a little bit more than just the sun setting. And then stars, 1 to 2 second intervals, just because we don't want too much time for the stars to move, because we've got extremely long shutter speeds. We're shooting at 20-30 second shutter speeds. And here's an example of the Milky Way rolling around in the outpost, which is very cool. And then lastly is when we're creating, when we're creating star trails, what we're doing is we don't want an interval, and I like shooting my trails in individual photographs and putting them together. If you watch the Astro, I showed you how we do that and the settings that we use to do that. But basically, we don't want an interval because we don't want spaces between where the lines are going. So here's an example of that. And effectively, what we're getting are these trails that I can create one image from, and I can use those images to create a moving time lapse like this. I'm going to start it again because that. So that's effectively what we're looking at there. So if you want to take a photo of that with your cell phone, you're more than welcome to. And then lastly, we're going to go into editing. Now, when we're talking editing, I was talking about RAW and JPEG. RAW is definitely a better option. A compressed RAW has 4,096 variants from the lightest form of a color to the darkest form of a color, where a JPEG is effectively a file which has been compressed. It's like packing for a NetHab trip. You're told you are only allowed so much luggage. And so you pack the things you need, you zip it up, you lock the bag because we're going into air travel. And if you're coming out into crazy places, sometimes you'll even get it wrapped in cellophane. What happens is your bag gets compressed down to the smaller size, but it's all safe and sound. That's what a JPEG is. It's easy to transport, it's smaller and better. But now if I start editing it and I want to change the t-shirt, I now have to tear that open. I have to unlock the zip. I have to open it up. I change the shirt and the file is somewhat broken. And there are only 256 variants from the lightest form of a color to its darkest form. When we're shooting in full 14-bit RAW, we have 16,000 variants of color from its lightest to its darkest form. So we have a lot more ability to push and pull it. It's like taking our entire cupboard on a trip with us, where we can dig into the wardrobe and grab whatever shirt we like whenever we like it. Now I'm going to show you the basics of editing. This was pre-recorded, so I'm going to let it run, enjoy it, and please, as you're going along, there's space for questions. You're more than welcome to send questions through, and once this is done, I will tackle any questions that you may have. Enjoy the editing.
I use two programs. One is process. I use two programs. One is Lightroom, and the other one is LR Time-Lapse. So this is LR Time-Lapse, and what I will do is I'll find my sequence in LR Time-Lapse. I will then work out keyframes. So here I'm showing you I've got 5 keyframes, which means I'm going to edit 5 images within this sequence, and that will allow me to not have to edit 180. I've chosen this one because there's sunbeams in this specific time lapse, and it looks pretty. And what we will do is we're going to look at this time lapse and how it comes out. So I will choose my keyframes, I'll save that, and then I'll drag that into Lightroom. Now, once I've got it into Lightroom, it's now going to import. So I'm going to import all of these images, and I choose the folder where it's going to go, etc., all the normal stuff, and it will start to import those images. as we're going along. Now, what it's done is it's added keyframes. So these keyframes, I will only edit those keyframes. So what I can do is I just click the keyframes. This will then run through, and I have my 5 keyframes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit just these ones. Now, because the sequence is pretty much the same all the way along, what we're going to do.
Sorry, Kendall, we've just got a
to the develop module and
technical issue again.
That's okay. That happens.
So here we go into the develop module.
It's wonderfully carrying on. I don't know how.
Going to edit each one. So
There we go. Sorry about that, guys. I'll keep you all entertained. You can see all the beautiful things here. The other thing while we're loading that up is I will show you here's a Holy Grail image. Okay, we're on the go again.
right, so now editing
All right.
in the correct way. We're going to make sure that the light comes through well. And how I'm going to do that is by lifting the shadows and dropping the highlights and making sure that the sun's rays really start to pop. The red areas show the highlights clipped, so we're going to, and the blue areas, the dark. So you can see there how we recover those shadows. And I was trying to keep, now we're getting a better bell curve. Now we've missed all those clip bits there, which is fantastic. And now we need to bring back the highlights a little bit. We're going to drop the blacks so that we can create a little bit of contrast. I don't mind a bit of detail lost in those areas. It's not going to be a problem. And now we're going to recover a bit of the highlights so that that goes down. You'll see that that white goes back to nothing at the top there. Right, then within this, there is a great thing where we will use our texture sliders. We're going to go to the graduated filter, and it automatically, LR Time-Lapse installs these 4 points, 2 of them from the top down and 2 of them from the bottom up. So you can see the red areas are where we're going to work. You can move those around as you need to, and you don't need to add any others onto this. So what I'll do is I'll work at the bottom there on that first one. I'll move it up so that I can get to the bottom ground, and I'm only going to work within the red areas. So it's this graduated filter which allows me to work in specific areas. I'll put up the clarity there, some texture, and a little bit of the shadows to pull them out a little bit more. So that's a great way of creating a contrast down there and make that all look good. We're now going to work on the top. So I'm going to look at where that's moving and how the red is impacting that around us. I'm going to cool this down a bit to make the sky a little bluer than what it was. And I'm going to add some texture and some clarity and definitely some dehaze. And dehaze is a great way. Watch how those sun's rays start to pop out. It really helps with the workflow of this whole thing. So I love the dehaze button for skies, and we can lift the shadows a bit and just create a bit more contrast so we create the punch. Now, you wouldn't be able to do that within a video. I can put the saturation up again to bring the blues out a little bit more, and that will be great. From there, we're going to have to edit across all of these images. So now you can see the final image there. It looks pretty nice. You get the real impact of those rays, and once we move it into a time-lapse, you're really going to see them starting to move. So now we've got to sync these across all of the different images. And for this, because they're the same, you have to use that scroll thing up at the top. It's a lot of time-lapse sync keyframes. That means this one will now have taken on the exact same settings as the other one, which really helps us. And because all of these are the same, I'm just going to literally sync them across. We're going to look at a different one where each keyframe becomes different, and we will have to look at how we do that. So we're going to edit through that shortly. I had so much sports trying to put these things together last night. My computer was not loving me and was dying and switching off and doing crazy things. So I'm happy that we got to get these all out to you guys. While this is running through, I'm just going to check if there are any questions. The Sun app is called Photo Pills. Photo Pills. It's a really, really great app, and it works. There's so many different functions. I just don't have the time to go through it, but it was a great question, and please keep them coming. All right, so now we've gone back in and we've now reloaded the 5 images that we have now worked on, and we're doing auto transition. So now, because I've worked on 5 images, what it's going to do is it's going to work out what the difference is and how I change those images and create a slow curve to make it work perfectly. And it is a beautiful thing to do. We then click the visualization button, the visual previews, and this will create a visual preview of what our thing looks like. So if I hit the play button down there, we'll actually get a visual playback of what it's going to look like. We can then do a deflicker, which is where light actually changes a little bit between frames. And within this, you can either smooth it out or slow it down, but it has this incredible way of working, and it works really fast and very accurately to be able to do that. We can even do a deflicker multiple times or choose spaces where we do it. But you can go check out LR Time-Lapse. I'm going to put a link to LR Time-Lapse in my social media menu and in my Instagram feed, in my bio. So now what we're going to do is we're going to read the data from the files. So that now LR Time-Lapse has made changes to it. Now we're going to read that so that all of those changes will then go across all of these. I'm just going to speed it up by taking or filtering out these things, and it can roll through and do what it needs to do faster. And what that's going to do now is it places all the minute changes of editing have automatically been done by LR Time-Lapse. It's an incredible thing. Then we go to our library, we select all, and we export. Now we can choose our output path, the name of where we're going to go, the resolution we're going to export at, and what type. So we can do JPEG, 8-bit, 16-bit, TIFF. It all just depends on which thing you choose to go from. But then we're going to hit export, and once that goes, that's then going to run through an entire export situation where we then, I've already done it, so we'll go back here. And what it does is it pops up this little render screen, which I'm going to open here. There's my render screen, says where it's from, where it's going to, chooses our, we then choose our codec of what we want. MP4 is an easy file size. I like 4K because it gives me space to move things around, like I was saying in Premiere Pro, that we can move things around. We then have frame rates, so I can choose different frame rates. At 24 frames, it's going to give us 7 seconds. If I go to 29, it's going to drop it to 6 seconds. And so we can change the whole thing. So I'm going to choose 24 there. Quality, I always choose high unless the video needs more. I will then go to very high and ultra high, but very high, high is fine. I can force a 16:9 crop on that, or I can just leave it where it is. And when I do and move that around, or I can just leave the forced unclicked, which I'm going to do because I prefer to be able to do that in post in Premiere Pro myself. So I will choose where that goes, how it's going to go there. Then I can choose my motion blur, how much motion blur I want. If I couldn't slow my shutter speed enough, I could do it post in here, and I can sharpen the image. So I'm going to click render video. It's then going to run through the process down the bottom here really quickly because I speeded it up. I sped it up, and at this point it died a few times. Okay, and then once it's done, it opens up this dialog box with our video. So if we open the video, am I going to do that? No, I'm going to open Premiere Pro, and I'm going to drop it straight into Premiere Pro, and then we're going to edit it now. So I have a a project there called Time-Lapse. I'm going to open up Time-Lapse. I'm going to go to my editing view, and I'm going to drop that into Premiere Pro. And this is where I'm now going to mimic that movement that I was talking about. So I'm going to choose a new sequence. I'm going to choose what I want. So I've chosen a 1080p 24 frames a second. I'm calling it an Ndali time-lapse because it is at a place called Ndali in Uganda. I'm then going to drag that time-lapse onto the thing and say, keep existing settings, the ones that I chose. Because remember, it was shot in 4K. So now because it's 4K, it's bigger than what the rest of the screen is. I need to change my sizing to 50% so that I get the right amount in there, and I can move these around. Now, this is where I generate the movement. Now, there's a lot of tutorials on this, guys. I know it's running through fast, but I just want to give you a good idea of how I create this and what my thought process is behind it. What we'll do then is I now want to create a beautiful bit of movement, slow movement besides the clouds, which will give it the camera a dynamic feel. So I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to move it down a little bit so that we have a better feel of that. There's a little crater lake at the bottom there. And you can see my keyframes being formed just to the right of my cursor. There we go. And that's my zoom in. And I'm going to drop it still a little bit more there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move those two keyframes to the beginning of the sequence. So now that's the zoom in. It's going to affect that. And now I'm going to create a new keyframe of 50, and I'm going to put these back to what their normal values are so that I can get back to that. Now what I've done is I've created a second keyframe for each of these, scale and movement, and I can move those out. Now, when I do the playback, which I'll do down here, you will see the camera move back. So it gets wider and wider, and we get this very different view of the whole thing. From there, we'll export it.
Right, we're trying to get out of there again. Okay, so that's basically time-lapse in a little nutshell. Kendall, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, we've got some great ones for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. And I know we're almost at the top of the hour here, so we'll take questions for the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, first question. A couple of people wanted you to repeat the names of the tripods you recommended and just the specific models.
Sure. So this one is called the Manfrotto Element, and this works really well. There's a couple of different ones from aluminium to carbon fiber, depending on what your price bracket is. And then the other one is a Peak Design tripod, Peak Design. It's the only tripod they've created. It's beautiful. As soon as I get a chance, I'm going to get one out and start using it myself. But I'm a bit of an equipment fanatic like that.
Great. And a couple people would like it if you could repeat the 7 P's again.
Proper, prior, planning, prevents, poor performance.
That's great.
I love it. It was taught to me by a NetApp guest, so not my fault. Yes.
What size and type of memory cards do you recommend?
So again, so when you're dealing with video and things like this, it depends how long we are using things for. The biggest thought process when it comes to a memory card is around the speed of the memory card. Can it match up to what your camera is shooting? So for example, this Sony Alpha 1 is a 50 megapixel camera and shoots at 30 frames a second. Every single file at 50 megapixels is over 100 megabytes times by the 30 seconds means that we are writing 3 gigs of information every second. So we need a card that can write at that speed or fast enough to it. So what I have for my Alpha 1 is I have a 160 gig CF card because of the image sizes. Before I had the A1, I had the A9 II, which is only 24 megapixels, and I was working off of 32 gig cards because the file sizes weren't outrageously large, and then making sure that I had the fastest cards. So that you got to read the megabits per second, what the right speed is. That will give you an idea. Because if you buy an expensive camera, and let's liken it to a Ferrari, you buy this Ferrari and you put a little Volkswagen Beetle's tires on it, the moment you push the accelerator, you're going nowhere because it can't write fast enough. So you just need to manage that. And then it all depends on how much you're doing. I think a 64 gig card is a good size. Anything more than that, you run the risk of not having enough cards, that if one card fails, you're out of cards. So just bear that in mind.
Mm-hmm. What is the requirement for the battery? If someone's doing continuous shooting for an hour and a half, what would be required?
So again, most cameras would be able to take that sort of shooting, even though, you know, if you're shooting for an hour and a half, every 3 seconds, it means that you're taking 20 photos every minute for 90 minutes, which means you're only taking, oh, geez, my maths has gone silly now, but you're taking 1,800 photographs. Can your camera handle taking 1,800 photographs in that time? And that's what you've got to realize. Like my Sony's can do about 1,200 on one battery. So I consider what that is. Then some of the newer cameras also have the ability to plug a plug point in or a power bank. So I used that when I was shooting the start time lapse, is I put a power bank in to make sure that there was enough battery that it would constantly run through that process.
Mm-hmm. And a couple people are curious about your thoughts of the time-lapse function on the iPhone, and can it be edited at all?
Yeah. So time-lapse function on the iPhone is so cool. It can be done for so many different things. I've used it on trips where you're driving and you just hold the camera and do a time-lapse as you're moving along, and that's what we call a hyperlapse because you're moving and everything else is moving, so it's quite intense, but it's very cool. It works really well. Your editing is just limited to exactly what we were suffering with internal time lapse within a camera or shooting a video and speeding it up, because video editing is tougher in terms of getting light and changing things within that. In terms of cutting it shorter and putting it in other things, it works perfectly. So definitely don't discount the iPhone's time lapse ability.
All right, great. Looks like we have a request for a webinar on iPhone time lapses, so we may have to get that scheduled soon. All right,
I think
Rich.
we'll do an iPhoneography one.
Ooh, yeah, there we go. Perfect. I think we've answered all the questions today, so I'm going to call it there. Thank you so much, Rich. This was really interesting. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thank you all for tuning in and the questions, and I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you're going to be going out and doing some fun things with something new. And thank you to NatHab, and thank you, Kendall, for hosting it. You are the best host. I love you long time, and we'll chat to you guys at the next webinar.
Thank you, Richard, and my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, guys.